Our scripture reading this morning is from Acts. While Paul waited for them in Athens, he was deeply distressed to find that the city was flooded with idols. He began to interact with the Jews and Gentile God worshippers in the synagogue. He also addressed whoever happened to be in the marketplace each day. Certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers engaged him in discussion too. Some said, "What an amateur! What is he trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods." They said this because he was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. They took him into custody and brought him to the council on Mars Hills. "What is this new teaching? Can we learn what you are talking about? You've told us some strange things, and we want to know what they mean." They said this because all Athenians, as well as the foreigners who live in Athens, used to spend their time doing nothing but talking about or listening to the newest thing. Paul stood up in the middle of the council on Mars Hills and said, "People of Athens, I see that you are very religious in every way. As I was walking through town and carefully observing your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What you worship as unknown, I now proclaim to you. God, who made the world and everything in it, is ruler of heaven and earth and doesn't live in temples made with human hands. Nor is God served by human hands, as though God needed something, since God is the one who gives life, breath, and everything else. From one person, God created every human nation to live on the whole earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their lands. God made the nations so they would seek God, perhaps even reach out and find God. In fact, God isn't far away from any of us. In God, we live, move, and exist. As some of your own poets said, we are God's offspring. Therefore, as God's offspring, we have no need to imagine that the divine being is like a gold, silver, or stone image made by human skill and thought. So ends our scripture reading. Ancient words from our tradition for today's present-day understanding.
Actually, the title of the sermon that's in your bulletin is not accurate. Yeah, it's wrong. You remember last week I was going to preach on that subject, and then the Kavanaugh decision came down, and I didn't feel that it would be fair to the congregation not to address that in some way. So this week we're getting back to that. So technically speaking, this is not political at all. But the truth is that whether we call it theology or mythology or metaphysics, those deep assumptions about what it means to be a human being in the cosmos have ramifications that affect art, politics, everything, science, everything. What we're really talking about is the deep subjective foundation upon which we are putting our lives together. As I thought about this sermon this week, I kept flashing back to being in timeout after I'd made my Sunday school teacher cry as a kid, which was a very baffling experience for me because I'm sitting there in the little chair saying, well, they're supposed to be the adults, right? But the truth was, these were kind, wonderful people who had dedicated and given time to help me, like, go to Sunday school. But they'd never really thought about what they were teaching. Someone had told them, this is just the truth, pass it on. And they were doing the best they could do, but a kid's questions were too much for them. And if a kid's questions were too much, think what life could have done. They were saying that there was a God and, Jesus was up in heaven and stuff, and it all looked kind of like me. Right, I see these pictures of the blonde Jesus and, fresh from the ski slopes, and a God who had form looked like a human being, an old guy. And now that I'm an old guy myself, that makes a lot of sense, but for some of you, that's not a very good image, is it? And the truth is, any image we choose for the sacred, if it's too concrete, becomes a problem for somebody else. And so they told me that God had this form, but also was invisible. How do those two things match? If God is invisible, how does God have white hair and a beard? It didn't make any sense. I wasn't trying to cause trouble, but it just didn't equate. They said I should seek and find God, and God is everywhere. Now, how do those two pieces fit together? How do you look for something that's everywhere? When I got to college, I learned what the problem was. There's a little thing called Occam's razor. And it's one of the undergirding principles of science and the modern mind, which that if you can put a worldview together without invisible magic agents, please do so. Now, in the ancient world, they tried to think of the cosmos as a large version of a human being. And so when anything moved around them, it made sense that there has to be something like a human being that's moving things. And even Aristotle believed that. There has to, after all the causes are laid out, there has to be one unmoved mover that's moving everything. And the personal expression of that is when something happens to me, it had to happen for a reason. If I get sick, there has to be some lesson in this. There's some reason why that human, invisible, large person has done this to me. And you can understand how that leads some people to a crisis at the worst time for them. When you have that mythology of one being that's causing everything to happen. Obviously, you're not going to be very scientific if you think that this invisible being is leaving clues for you everywhere. And I've looked at life that way. I think that's a song. I've looked at life. But like God is leaving these little Easter eggs for you. I should be a plumber. No, wait. The ministry. No, wait. And it's painful and maddening, and you feel so left behind. So betrayed by this being who's supposed to be guiding you and speaking. Why doesn't, not a very talkative God. So what does theology look like? What does religion look like without this invisible mover behind it? Now, what I want to suggest is it's going to be a whole lot better. And that we can put the invisible person to the side without losing the personal. That's one of the reformations, I believe, is how do you keep the personal without the sacred being a person? Because whatever this is, it's got to also be the source of trees and dolphins and ants. It can't look like all of those things. And when I believe that life was designed for me, it doesn't make any freaking sense. When things are good, yeah. God wanted me to have that that promotion. But what happens when I get cancer? When my marriage doesn't work out? When my children don't want to be with me? Life breaks down at the time when you need that, the personal most of all. And fear becomes overwhelming when we project the personal onto our experience. When I was a very little kid, I don't even remember how young, but very, very young, there was a tree at the end of the block that made me cry. It terrified me because it looked like a claw. And I was projecting onto it. My fear was absolutely real. I couldn't be more afraid of it. But I remember my parents just kind of trying to comfort me and not laugh. And I could see it was, they were having trouble understanding why the tree was terrifying me. But what isn't terrifying when you believe in a world of superstition? And desire becomes torture under that framework. In Tibet, they have that figure of the hungry ghost, where the mouth is the pinprick and the stomach is huge. Right? That's desire from the viewpoints of the ego. And what the mystics tell us is the missing ingredient that we don't realize is that not only are our images of the sacred person mythological, but the ego is mythological. You are not standing outside of the universe looking at it. And if we don't have some way of counterbalancing that, which is what the symbols do, then we're governed by this false self that cannot be satisfied, cannot be happy, and is terrified of everything. When you look at the politics around us, it starts here with the religion that didn't grow as new things were learned about the universe. See, it doesn't just stop with my life, even though I want to be personal. I choose ideas because that gives me comfort. But it doesn't stop there. So we're going to look at a story today that I think can be very helpful. St. Paul this is Luke writing, so Luke is using Paul. Paul goes to Athens, and it's called Mars Hill. This is a place in Athens where Mars, was the god of war, was put on trial for killing somebody, and the other gods were there. There are all these temples, and Paul looks around, and I don't think the problem is that they have other faiths than Christianity, right? Because remember, again, Christianity has not started yet. Right, there isn't the Apostles' Creed, there isn't the New Testament, there's none of that stuff exists. So Paul can't be mad at their lack of orthodoxy. Instead, it's that superstition of that religion that's been chosen because it makes us comfortable, it makes us feel safe. But it bumps up against everybody else's personal, private religion. So Paul is this genius. I think anyway. It talks about him talking to the Stoics and the Epicureans. He knew these people. He knew these philosophies. And he's learning these things to decode them. And what he's seeing, the problem is not other religions. The problem is superstition. As St. Stevie Wonder said, and it's so true. When you believe in things you don't understand, you suffer. Period. No matter how wonderful they are, no matter how comforting, no matter how much they hold us together in some ways, in other ways, when I simply believe things because they give me comfort, I suffer in a different way. So, Paul says, everybody's looking for God, but God is that beyond human invention. So every religion is true in some ways, and none of them completely expresses that truth that is there. Now, when I was in seminary and we studied this verse, I went looking, what is the poem he's quoting? Who is this poet he's quoting? And I found it. I think that's kind of important, don't you? says, let us begin with Zeus. This is the poem that Paul is quoting. One of them, there's actually three, I think, that he's using in this section. He goes, let us begin with Zeus, whom we mortals who never leave unspoken. And let me just say, Zeus, when you look at it in Greek, it's the word we get zoo from. It means life. It's the energies of life, that kind of electrical power that organizes life. That's what the thunderbolts stand for. Because let us begin with Zeus, whom we mortals never leave unspoken. For every street, every marketplace is full of Zeus. Even the sea and the harbor are full of Zeus. Everywhere, everyone is indebted to Zeus, for we are all Zeus's offspring. Now, what Paul's going to do in this little phrase that he gives, in God we live, breathe, and have our being, to the philosophers is going to mean a lot. The word he uses for life is the word for Zeus, Zoa. Again, we get zoo from it. It's the power of life. The word that he uses for we move is, we get the word cinema from it. It means to move things around, like the invisible being is supposed to do. And having being, the basis of a lot of the philosophy was what is real, what is true. And whatever that is what Paul is going to be talking about. There was a temple for the unknown God. It had been built during the time of a plague, and they knew that some God was mad at them, but they couldn't figure out which God was mad at them. Again, when you are superstitious, getting away from fear is very hard. So they built a temple to an unknown God. Who's ever ticked at us, this is for you. Leave us alone. Lots of prayers in Greek religions. Please just leave us alone. We didn't do anything. Whatever we said, we didn't mean it. Just leave us alone. But what's happening here in this imagery that Paul is weaving is it's a great transformation where he's not talking through the ego anymore. Remember Chief Seattle's statement, nature does not belong to us, we belong to nature. Or the earth does not belong to us, we belong to earth. It's that transformation from looking and perceiving through the ego to looking and perceiving through the common life. Now, it's important not to lose the personal, because life isn't worth living without that. But we escape the terror, we escape the futile desire by looking at life as a whole and living life as a whole. When communion service was first being offered, and Jesus said, I'm the vine, you're the branches. It's saying life isn't centered around you. Jesus is speaking mythologically and saying, I'm the source of your life, whatever that is. You are a branch, you're an offshoot. And Paul's going to say we're offspring. We're coming out of it, so there's no point in looking for it. It's our source. We live out of it. And we recognize it in each other. The invisible can't have a face that's going to make us happy. But the good news is every face, every being is an expression of that same life. So when John says nobody's ever seen God, but when we love one another, God is there, that's what that means. You've not been abandoned, you've not been left behind. The personal is all around us. And the experience of that is deeply intimate. Here's Albert Einstein talking about the same thing. This is as a physicist. And I've quoted this before, but I think it's remarkable that a physicist would say this. He says, a human being is a part of the whole called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He's talking about the ego, the self. They experience themselves, their thoughts and feelings, as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of our consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task is to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. I think that's what Paul is saying. I think that's what the Greek poet is saying. And I think that's what Einstein is saying. It doesn't require a person, but it's incredibly personal. Now imagine that you're not really here. You're really at home asleep. Maybe where you wish you were. But you're home asleep. But you don't know that you're in a dream. You're trying to make sense of this, and you're listening to me for truth. You're listening for me to say, there's God right here. Right here's the object that deserves to be called God. But anything in your dream is not the dreamer. Right? If you're going to get in touch with the dreamer, you have to dissolve and realize everything in the dream is an expression. But you don't experience it by finding it like an Easter egg. You experience it the way a fish in the ocean would experience the saltiness or the warmth. It's a quality that imbues everything around you. And you sink, you dissolve into it. It's not a person, but it's intimately personal. One of the places you see that in the Psalms is they're going up to Jerusalem on this parade. And they look at all the temples around them up on hills. They say, I look to the hills. From which of these does my help come? And the psalmist says, from none of those, but from the energy that created the mountains. We're not part of the earth. I mean, the earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth. This great transformation. Here's how Oscar Wilde, who I don't think is a very good role model, probably, but he was obviously a mystic. He wrote a poem about this experience. He goes, one great, grand life throbs through the earth's giant heart, and mighty waves of single being roll from nerveless germ to human. We are part of every rock and bird and beast and hill, one with the things that prey on us and one with what we kill. Now think about this. As long as we live in the separate ego, death terrifies us. It stalks us. But what if we realize whatever that is what we're born out of, what we live in, and what we return to it? What if that is who we truly are? What if this sacred something is closer to us than our breath, closer to us than our bloodstream? Because whatever source we're coming out of is more truly us than we are ourselves. Rumi, this truth is all over the world, but I think the Sufis have a good way of putting it. Their playfulness helps us get there. This is Rumi. He said, the people of this world are like three butterflies in front of a candle's flame. The first one went closer and said, I know about love. The second one touched the flame lightly with its wings and said, I know how love's fire can burn. The third one threw itself into the heart of the flame and was consumed. It alone knows what true love is. That's not pleasant. I see the faces. But by throwing ourselves into life, into loving, not standing out of it, not thinking we're outside of the river of life watching all these poor twerps be born and die. Realizing we are the river. We're not these ephemeral bubbles that our ego tells us we are. We're the flow. We're the river. Here's another Rumi. And again, it's disturbing, but who's being disturbed is the ego. The false self that doesn't want to lose control. That's what the crucifixion stands for. It's the ego that's crucified and the great life that's resurrected. This is, Rumi's going to talk about this kind of salvation as a shipwreck. Because from the ego's perspective, that's what it is. It goes, should love's heart rejoice unless I burn? This is talking about entering so fully into life that there's nothing left behind. For my heart is love's dwelling. If you will burn your house, burn it, love. From now on, I will make burning my aim. For I am like the candle, burning only makes me brighter. Abandon sleep tonight, traverse for one night the region of the sleepless. Look upon these lovers who have become distraught, like moths have died in union with the one beloved. Look upon this ship of God's creatures and see how it is sunk in love. As long as we're happy in the ego, we don't want this truth. So if you're comfortable, this isn't probably a sermon for you. But if your ego has already hit an iceberg, and it will, and you get that diagnosis that destroys any meaning that the ego could possibly find, or the person that you've given your heart to doesn't love you anymore, and the entire story that you'd written for the future is in shambles. Isn't it good to know that you're burning into your source? That you're sinking down into that ocean in which you live, breathe, have your being. I think the place we feel this most fully in Christian theology is Christmas. In Christmas, there are all these hymns, and they're horrible. They're about the cold, it's dark, it's silent. Right? I mean, if you look at that literally from the ego's point of view, you don't want any of that, so that's depressing. So why is it so joyful? Because the ego dissolves. That's one place that theology is working completely, where you feel yourself as a part of the cosmic. And whatever's happening in your life, you're able to put it to the side a little bit and realize you're deeper. Your life is deeper and more profound than you would have imagined. Here's from Zen Buddhism. This is one of the founders of Zen. This is Dogen. If you want to travel the way of Buddhas and Zen masters, then expect nothing, seek nothing, and grasp nothing. Enlightenment is intimacy with all beings. What an incredible dissolving into the personal. There's a sense in which as long as we're looking for God, we're lost by definition. We're looking for the dreamer in the dream. We're looking for the cause in the effect. We're looking for the universal in the particular. And that's a very sad road to live in life. What happens when you let yourself dissolve, die, and be reborn into the large life is that suddenly you have this sense of blossoming, even in the shambles. You have a sense of other people having a depth and a wisdom they're teaching you, even though there's nothing being said or consciously being exchanged. There's a sense life is guiding you and teaching you intimately, personally. You look in your dog's face and you're seeing a window into the cosmos. You've had that happen. Or into the face of an infant. That kid doesn't know what's best for your life. Doesn't even have words. But somehow you look in those eyes and it goes down into that process, the cosmic, the living, the source of your being. And you're able to put whatever's happening to you in that context. It's an amazing thing. But as soon as we can be here and now and love the people we are with as the person we are, as soon as we can be here and now, then we can experience that which is everywhere. I want to close with Oscar Wilde, and like I say, he's probably not being preached on very much in Presbyterian pulpits this Sunday, but the wise can learn from anyone. We shall be notes in that great symphony, whose cadence circles through the rhythmic spheres, and all the world's throbbing heart shall be one with our heart. The stealthy, creeping years have lost their terror now. We shall not die. The universe itself shall be our immortality. I invite you now to your own reflection on these words.